I was 11 years old the first time my mother told me I ruined her life. She said it quietly, almost to herself, while she thought I was asleep on the couch behind her, talking on the phone to her sister about the man she could have married if she hadn't gotten pregnant with me at 22. I never told her I heard it. I carried that sentence for 20 years. The way you carry a stone in your pocket you never quite decide to throw away. My name is Olivia. I was 31 years old when I got the call that my mother was in the hospital, alone, with nobody else willing to come. And out of everyone in our family, the people she'd spent her whole life choosing over me, I was the only one who showed up. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel like a mistake, stay with me. Because this story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when you choose to show up anyway. My mother, Denise, was 22 years old when she found out she was pregnant with me. She'd been dating my father for 8 months, a relationship she later described, more than once, in front of me, as the biggest mistake of my life, right up until the second biggest one. She meant me. I understood that from a very young age, even before I fully understood the words she was using. Children are remarkably good at absorbing the emotional temperature of a room long before they can articulate what they're feeling. My father left before I turned 2. I don't remember him at all, just a handful of photographs my mother kept, not out of sentiment, but because she used them, periodically, as evidence in the ongoing case she seemed to be building against her own life. "This is the man who left us both," she'd say, holding up a photo during arguments, as though I bore some responsibility for a decision made before I could walk. My mother raised me alone in a small apartment 2 towns over from where she grew up, working double shifts at a diner, and I want to be fair to her, because this story isn't about pretending she didn't sacrifice things for me. She did. She kept food on the table. She kept a roof over both our heads. She showed up to parent-teacher conferences, mostly, when her shifts allowed it. But she also made sure, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that I understood my existence had cost her something. That the life she might have had a different man, a different city, a career she'd abandoned when she got pregnant, had been traded away for me, and that trade was one she resented more openly with each passing year. The comment I overheard when I was 11 wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the first time I heard the thought stated plainly, in words, instead of just felt in the space between us. When I was 14, my mother remarried. Her new husband, Frank, had 2 children from a previous marriage, a boy and a girl close to my age, and almost overnight, the emotional center of our household shifted entirely away from me. I don't think this was a conscious decision on my mother's part, not in the sense of sitting down and choosing to favor 2 children who weren't biologically hers over her own daughter. I think it was simpler and sadder than that. Frank's children represented, to her, a version of family life that hadn't cost her anything. They hadn't derailed her 20s. They hadn't been born out of a relationship she regretted. They were, in some unspoken way, easier for her to love, without the complicated resentment that had attached itself to me since before I was born. I watched her attend every one of my stepsister's dance recitals, while missing 2 of my own school events for work, though, by then, I suspected work wasn't always the real reason. I watched her celebrate my stepbrother's modest academic achievements, with a warmth I rarely felt directed at my own, often better, report cards. I stopped bringing home my grades to show her sometime around 16, not out of rebellion, but because I'd learned, through repeated small disappointments, that her praise for my achievements always felt slightly effortful in a way her praise for theirs never did. I left home the week after I turned 18, moving in with a friend from school, and working 2 jobs to put myself through community college. My mother didn't ask me to stay. I remember that clearly, not because I expected her to beg, but because even a small, half-hearted request would have meant something. She simply said, "Well, you're an adult now," and helped me carry one box to my friend's car for the next several years. Our relationship existed mostly in the space between obligatory holiday phone calls and the occasional birthday text, sent late, sometimes a full day after the actual date. I built a life on my own terms during that time. I finished my degree. I built a career in healthcare administration that I was proud of, slowly, methodically, without the kind of parental cheerleading most people take for granted. I got married at 26 to a man named David, who was patient enough to understand, without ever needing a full explanation, why my relationship with my mother was complicated in ways I didn't always have words for. She came to my wedding. I'll give her that. But she spent much of the reception at a table with Frank's children, now adults themselves, laughing in a way I rarely saw her laugh with me, and when it came time for the mother-daughter dance, a tradition I'd almost skipped entirely because I wasn't sure it would feel authentic, she held me at an arm's length that felt less like formality and more like the physical manifestation of 26 years of emotional distance neither of us knew how to close. Frank passed away when I was 28, unexpectedly, from a heart attack. My mother, in the aftermath, leaned heavily on her stepchildren for support, which I understood, and didn't resent exactly, though it did confirm something I'd long suspected, that whatever bond she'd built with them over the years had become more genuine, more comfortable, than whatever remained between us. I called her every few weeks during that period, mostly out of a sense of obligation I couldn't fully name or justify to myself, given everything. She was often short with me on those calls, distracted, sometimes visibly relieved when I said I needed to go. I told myself this was just grief. I told myself a lot of things, over the years, to make her behavior easier to carry. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 years after Frank's death, from a hospital I didn't recognize, in a city 40 minutes from where my mother now lived alone. A nurse explained that my mother had been admitted after a serious fall in her apartment, that she'd been unconscious for several hours before a neighbor found her, and that she'd listed me as her emergency contact. I remember being surprised by that last detail. Not that she'd have an emergency contact, obviously she needed one, but that it was me, specifically, given how little contact we'd had in recent years, and given that Frank's children lived closer, saw her more often, and by every reasonable measure, seemed like the more natural choice. I drove to that hospital within the hour, my mind racing through a complicated mixture of fear, and something harder to name, a kind of exhausted, reflexive love that had never fully died, no matter how many years of distance and disappointment had accumulated on top of it. When I arrived, a nurse informed me that my mother had regained consciousness, that her condition was serious but stable, and that they'd been trying, unsuccessfully, to reach any other family members for the past several hours. I asked if anyone else had called back. The nurse checked her notes and said no. Not Frank's daughter, whom my mother had spent countless holidays doting on. Not his son, whom she'd helped move into his first apartment 3 years earlier, an effort she'd never once offered me at the same age. Nobody had answered. Nobody had called back. Nobody, apparently, considered themselves obligated enough to show up. I sat in a hospital hallway that afternoon and felt something complicated settle over me. Not vindication, exactly. Something closer to grief for a version of this moment I'd always secretly hoped would look different. When I walked into her room, my mother looked smaller than I remembered. Fragile in a way that startled me, her face bruised from the fall. An IV in her arm, machines beeping quietly beside her. She turned her head slowly when I entered, and for a long moment, She didn't say anything at all. I watched something move across her face that I couldn't immediately identify, not quite surprise, not quite relief, something more complicated than either. "You came," she finally said, her voice rough from disuse. "Of course I came," I said, and I meant it, though even as I said it, some old, bruised part of me was quietly asking why of course had never once applied to her showing up for me, across 31 years of small and large disappointments. She told me slowly over the next hour that she'd tried calling Frank's children first, before the neighbor even found her, back when she'd first felt the fall coming, and had enough presence of mind to reach for her phone. Neither of them had answered. She'd left messages that, according to the hospital records, went unreturned for over 6 hours. I asked, gently, why she'd listed me as her emergency contact at all, given how little we'd spoken in recent years. She was quiet for a long time before she answered. Because somewhere, underneath everything I never said right, I always knew you were the one who'd actually come. I didn't know what to do with that sentence, sitting there in a hospital room with a woman who had told me, more times than I could count, in more ways than one, that my existence had ruined her life. I didn't say anything in response, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much, all at once, to find words that could hold it. I stayed with her for the next several days while she recovered, sleeping in an uncomfortable hospital chair, bringing her coffee from the cafeteria every morning, sitting with her through physical therapy sessions that clearly exhausted and frustrated her. On the 3rd day, she brought up the comment. The one from when I was 11. The one I'd never told her I'd overheard. The one I'd carried silently for 20 years. "I need to tell you something," she said, staring at the ceiling rather than at me. "I said things to you, when you were young, that I've regretted for a long time. Things about your father. About my life. I think, sometimes, you might have heard more of it than I realized." I told her the truth. I told her about that night on the couch, about the phone call with her sister, about the sentence that had lived in me for 2 decades, quietly shaping how I understood my own worth in her eyes. She cried then, in a way I don't think I'd ever seen her cry before, not performative, not for an audience, just quiet, exhausted grief for a mistake she couldn't undo. "You didn't ruin my life," she said finally. "I was 22 and terrified, and I said something cruel and stupid because I didn't know how to carry my own fear without putting it somewhere. I put it on you. That was never fair, and I've spent 20 years too ashamed to fix it, so I just kept not fixing it, which made it worse. I want to be honest about something here. That conversation didn't erase 20 years of feeling like an afterthought in my own mother's life. It didn't undo the recitals she chose over my school events, or the wedding dance held at arm's length, or the quiet years of distance that followed Frank's death. Healing doesn't work that cleanly, and I think stories that pretend it does a disservice to anyone who's actually lived through something like this. But it was, finally, an honest accounting of something that had gone unspoken for far too long. And, honestly, at 31 years old, sitting beside a hospital bed holding my mother's hand, that honesty mattered more to me than an apology alone ever could have. People have asked me, since this happened, why I was the one who came. Why, after everything, after being so clearly less prioritized than 2 children who weren't even biologically hers, I was the one who drove 40 minutes, on a Tuesday afternoon, without a second thought. I've thought about that question a lot, and I don't think the answer is complicated, even though the relationship itself was. I showed up because that's who I decided to become, somewhere in my 20s, independent of how my mother treated me. I decided, consciously, that I wasn't going to let her failures as a parent turn me into someone who abandons people when they need help, even people who hadn't always shown up for me. That decision had nothing to do with earning her love, or proving a point, or securing some kind of moral high ground. It had everything to do with the kind of person I wanted to be able to look at in the mirror, regardless of what my mother did or didn't deserve from me in return. Frank's children, as far as I know, still haven't fully explained why they didn't answer those calls. I don't feel anger toward them, honestly. People show up, or they don't, for reasons that are usually more complicated than simple cruelty-busy lives, unprocessed resentments of their own, assumptions that someone else would handle it. I understand that better now than I might have a few years ago. What I know for certain is that when it mattered most, the daughter my mother once said had ruined her life was the only person who walked through that hospital door. It's been 2 years since that hospital stay. My relationship with my mother is different now. Not perfect, not the warm, uncomplicated bond I sometimes wished for as a child, but real in a way it hadn't been before. We talk weekly now, genuine conversations rather than obligatory check-ins. She's met my daughter, born the year after that hospital stay, and I've watched her hold my child with a tenderness I don't think I ever fully received myself at that age. And I've made peace with the complicated feelings that brings up, rather than pretending they don't exist. She said something to me recently, watching me feed my daughter at her kitchen table, that I think about often. I hope you never feel, for even a second, what I let you feel for 20 years. I told her I hoped so too, and then I told her something I meant with my whole heart, something that surprised even me the moment I said it out loud, that I was grateful, in a strange way, for the version of strength her absence had forced me to build, even as I wished, more than anything, that I'd never needed to build it at all. My mother didn't get the life she wanted at 22. I understand that now in a way I couldn't as a child, but somewhere along the way, without either of us fully realizing it was happening, I became the kind of daughter who shows up anyway, not because she earned it, but because that's simply who I chose to be. She told me I ruined her life when I was too young to understand what those words would cost me. 20 years later, I was the only one standing in that hospital room. I think in the end that says more about who I became than it ever did about who she was. If you've ever loved a parent who made you feel like a burden, and shown up for them anyway, I see you, and I hope this story reminded you that who you choose to become is always yours to decide, no matter what you were told as a child. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because next week I'm telling you about the grandmother who left everything to one grandchild in front of the whole family, and the letter she never got to send, found 15 years later.